Hello and welcome to the Wellesley Needlepoint Collection's Intro to Needlepoint. Today I'm going to be introducing you to a basic needlepoint stitch and rolling into doing the continental stitch. The things that you'll need to do this lesson will be a pair of scissors. I kind of like these storks because they're cute and they feel good and they're sharp. I'll put those there, they feel good in my hands. The second thing we're going to be using will be some thread. I'm using silk and ivory, which is a mix of silk and wool. It's a slightly thicker thread, but the canvas that I'm stitching on is a 13 mesh canvas, so this thread is what we use to cover the canvas well. And then the other thing that you'll need will be a needle threader. A couple things about the canvas before we get started. This here is just a little magnet that you can get, and you can put it on your work and it stores your needles for you. It's just a handy way to not end up with needles in your couch cushions. So a couple things about mesh. That's the canvas that's right here. And we're working on 13 mesh canvas. That means that there are 13 stitches per inch. There are many different sizes. The other popular size that you see is a 18 mesh canvas. So there would be 18 stitches per inch. So that canvas, those canvases would be tighter, the stitches would be smaller. We're using 13 today so that we can more easily see this canvas while we're working. So before we get rolling, I just want to talk a little bit about what a stitch is. I'm going to zoom in a little bit so you can see it. When you think about canvas, the way that I like to think about teaching needlepoint is this canvas is made up of all these threads that run this way and this way. And they're woven together. So you'll see some are like this and some are like that. But each intersection has a little X on it. And all a needlepoint stitch is when you're coming in this, say this hole, let's say I want to stitch this stitch right here, I would bring my thread up through this hole and then I would go down through that hole. And that, then my thread would lay across that X. That's your basic needlepoint stitch. So when people talk about traditional needlepoint, all it is bringing your thread up in one corner and taking it to the other corner so that that X is covered in thread. You'll hear kind of three different terms for the needlepoint stitch. You'll hear people use tent stitch, continental stitch, and basket weave stitch. The only difference between those three stitches is the order in which this little stitch that we do is connected together. So when you do the continental stitch, you would do a row at a time, but it's always that same stitch just going across the X in each one. In basket weave, you're doing a row also, but it's a diagonal row, and that would be in another video that we'll do. And then third is the tent stitch, which is often used when they're talking about maybe doing 2 or 3 stitches here, and then going over here and doing 2 or 3 stitches, but it's all basically the exact same stitch. So let's get started. All right, we're going to begin by threading the needle. Let me zoom out again so it's more easy to see. We need a thread, piece of thread, a needle threader for starters. Some people can do it without it, that's fine too. And a needle. And again, I'm using these needles. This is a size 20 tapestry needle. So a tapestry needle means that the eye is reasonably large so that threads can get through it, and the point is sharp like a needle, but not poking you and painful sharp. So when you use a needle threader, one of the ways to think about this is I want the thread to go through the needle eye. So the first thing I'm going to do is put the needle threader through the needle eye just like this. Okay, and then I'm going to hold it there. Then I'm going to get my thread, put it through the loop of the needle threader, hold it there, and move this out of the way so you can see, and then just pull the whole thing through and that's how I get the needle on my, or the thread on my needle, just like that. Now it is possible to do this without a needle threader. I'll show you that method as well. Some people are comfortable with it, but not all. So the way that I often thread my needles this way, unless the thread is very thick and it's having a hard time getting through. I hold the thread up into the needle like this. I kind of tighten it with the needle and I pinch it so that you can see just a teeny bit of it sticking out. Take the needle on its side and run it through like this. If you ever have trouble or you're using this method and it's not going through, try the other side of the needle. Needles are stamped and one side is usually different than the other side. It's very hard to see, but they are just a little bit different. So that's how you thread your needle. Okay, so now that my needle is threaded, and when you're working with your needle or your thread, you don't want, this is the tail, you don't want this too crazy long, and you also don't want it too short like this, because if it is, every time you pull the needle through, you might pull the needle off of the thread. So you just kind of keep it at a reasonable distance like this. Now I've done what's called a waist knot, so at the end of the thread I've tied a knot. And I'll explain to you how the waist knot works after we kind of get rolling with stitching. But I'm going to begin by just tied a knot and I run that through. That's going to secure my thread. Now, my first stitch, I'm coming up, and the stitch that I'm going to do, and I'm going to zoom in so you can more easily see it. The first stitch I'm going to do will be this X right there. So what I've done is I'm coming up in the lower left of that X, and I'm going to go down in the upper right of that same X. And the thread is going to gently cover it. Okay. Now in the continental stitch, you're going to do this little stitch, which is all needlepoint is just a bunch of these stitches put together in a row. So the next stitch I'm going to do will be the one I'm going to do is going to be the one right next to it. So I'm going to come up in that hole right next to the one I just stitched. And it's going to take you a while to know, see how I poke up and I go into a lot of different places. It'll take you a while to coordinate your eyes and your fingers to know how to bring the needle up from the back in the hole that you want, but it does get easier. Just practice will make it and you'll get it in no time at all. And even still, I sometimes struggle trying to find it. So you're coming in this hole right here, and because I'm going to do this stitch, I'm going to go right down in boop, that hole. There's my second stitch. Right. Now I can just keep going in a nice tidy row. If your thread starts to tangle or knot, just let the needle and the thread hang loose and unwind itself. Sometimes in the process of stitching, your needle and your thread will get wound and then they'll kind of knot and tangle. Don't sweat that, just let the thread hang down and unwind itself naturally. So there's my first row. All right, now it's time to do the row below it. So we have a couple different options, but the stitch that I want to stitch first will be this one right here. All right, and we can come up in this hole, again, the lower left of that little X, and go down in the upper right. But you can also come from the upper right and go to the lower left. As long as all your stitches are going in the same direction, that works too. You do have to be careful that when you're working on a project and you're holding it in your hand, it's very easy to move the canvas around. And so You do need to kind of check what the direction of the stitches are on another part of the canvas before you start stitching to be sure that all your stitches are going in the same direction. So I'm putting in my second row here. Now, as you can see, I'm actually working on all white blank canvas, and you're most likely going to be working on a painted canvas. So the way a painted canvas works is that each of these X's will be painted a color. And the better canvases that are stitch painted, which I highly recommend, are easier to know where to put your colors. So if I was stitching this and I was using green, I would be putting green over a stitch or a cross here that is painted green. It makes no difference what everything around it is painted. It just matters what that X is painted. And sometimes it can be a little bit vague. And then you can kind of use your creative license if you think that it should be that size or a different size or whatever. So there is, so I'm now starting on my third row. So after we get to the end of this third row, I'll show you how to switch colors and how to end your threads. Because if I now am encountering an area that is painted yellow, I'm going to want to put in a yellow thread. Okay, let's finish this row just like so. That's your continental stitch. All right, now what we want to do is secure this green thread and switch it for a different colored thread. So I'm going to zoom out so you can see how we do this. I'm going to flip the canvas over because my thread's on the back side. Oops, let's see if I can do this without knocking the thing over. And zoom in a tiny bit. So to secure a thread to the back of the canvas, all we want to do is run the thread, and this is a very fat needle, so it's a little tricky, but I'm going to just run the thread underneath the stitches that are there. Be careful you don't puncture to the other side of the canvas. You want this to all be on the back side. That alone is not enough to secure it. If I left it like this, it's possible the stitches on the other side would come out. So I do a locking stitch by just one or two little, sorry, doesn't need to be big. If you are working with a more slippery thread, you might find you need to actually do 2 locking stitches, but typically 1 is plenty. Now I'm just going to cut that off, and I can switch over to a different color thread. So this is the new color of thread that I'm going to use, this one is still in the condition that it comes in from a shop. So a lot of times you go to a needlepoint shop and you come home with these skeins of yarn or thread, and you don't know how to make them into usable pieces. So I will show you how to do that. But before we cut this apart, I just want to point out that it's helpful to hang on to these cards because they say on them what the color is, but they also tell you what the lot number is. This is important because if you run out of the thread, not all die lots of this color are going to be exactly the same. They could be just a smidgen off, and if you're doing a background and you run out in the middle, it might create a problem for you. So you want to hang on to the to this card so you know what die lot it is, and you know, if you doubt, you should buy more rather than less. So I just cut that accidentally. And we're just going to pull this skein apart and divide it up like this. So that I'm just looking at this. Okay. Now I'm going to hang on to the card. You can even take a little piece of thread and put it around that hole so that if you forget, you know what that skein is. And I cut this one end, and then I go to the other end and I cut that. And now I have threads that are ready to be worked. Typically when you store these, you just want to very gently tie them in a nice loose knot, and this will help keep them nice and tidy for your work. And various threads, you want to work with various lengths. So it kind of depends on how, if you use a really long strand on some projects, it will fray. So you might want to cut and work with a smaller strand. It's really, that's a personal choice. Okay, so we are going to thread this into the needle again, and I'll show the needle threading choice and the other option as well. So I'm running this through, put the needle threader in the needle first, run the thread through the needle threader, pull the strand through. So that's your first option. Your second option is pinch the thread between the needle. Use your finger and your thumb to squeeze it, and then just run your needle right over it, kind of coax that thread through. Either is fine, it's really your preference. Okay. Now, just like how we ended the green, this is how we're going to attach this new color onto our work. Since we have an area that already has some work on it, instead of doing a waist knot, we can actually attach this color to the back of this green. All right. So the way that I'm going to do that is exactly the way that I did ended the green. I'm just going to run it underneath like that. I'm not going to pull it all the way through. Now, if I started stitching right now, this would just pull right through. So I do need to do that tacking stitch to secure the thread. And then you just do a gentle tug to see if it's secure. If it were not, you'd have to do another tacking stitch. You can see that, so this is one way to secure thread. You can see that on the first, when we did the green, I had nothing to attach that green thread to. So I used what's called a waist knot. And you have to do this when you don't have some stitched area to put this on. I'm going to flip it over and I'll show you. You'll notice though that I was very careful about where I put the waist knot. Since I was starting to stitch here, I put the waist knot here, so that as I work down, I'm going to stitch over that green thread in back, and I will be able to cut off that waist knot in no time at all. So if you're just starting a brand new project and you need to, you don't have anything to attach a thread to like I just did here, you'll use the waist knot, you'll tie a knot, run it through the canvas, and go in where the background, where the thread that's running behind it is going to go over the area that you're going to work. Okay, so we're going to just do the next row. And I'll zoom in again so you can see it. So I'm doing this stitch right here, and I'm just going to go right like that. Now, typically, you would not do the dark colors first. I did the dark color first here because I thought it might be easier to see on the video. But typically, you would want to start your light colors on your project, because if you have a dark thread running behind this, sometimes the fibers from the dark green will pull through and show a shadow in your light colors. So normally you would want to start with your light colors and then work your way to your darker colors. You can see there's a teeny bit of green kind of peeking through on that hole right there. But again, I made an exception for this because I wanted to be sure that you could see the thread that I was putting onto the canvas. There we go. All right, so we'll finish up our third row here. So it's just putting together a bunch of going across the X in the same direction throughout the whole canvas. So now at this point, we have probably stitched over enough of that waist knot behind the underneath this work, so we can actually just snip this waist knot off. And that's pretty much how you do continental stitch in needlepoint. So now that you've learned how to do needlepoint in large areas that don't have any painting, I just want to add on to that and show you how to do needlepoint when the canvas is painted. So let's go back to, I'm going to zoom in so you can see we're going to start with the green area here. And it looks like they're actually, when I look at it closely, there are actually 3 colors of green. I've pulled 2 out. But the way that you know where to put the different color threads that you're working with are, once again, you're just going to look at this tiny little intersection that has an X on it, or that makes a little cross. And if that cross is painted green, you'll be putting a green stitch there. If it's painted pink, you'll be putting a pink stitch there. So, and you don't have to worry as much about order. Like when you do these little pink dots, you're just going to do this one and then this one and then this one. And you're obviously not going to be able to do it in a basket weave stitch because it's not a large area. And remember, the only difference between basket weave, continental, and tent stitch is the order in which you put all these little teeny stitches together. So this area right here, you would be doing in a tent stitch because there's no real rhyme or reason. So a few things to note about this. The difference is if you're working on a canvas that is not stitch painted, so what stitch painted means is that each of these intersections or stitches is clearly defined as light pink or dark pink. That is why canvases are so expensive, is because somebody's actually hand stitched each and every one of these stitches so they're clearly defined as one color or another, that doesn't have a watercolor effect that makes it virtually impossible to know where to put the different color stitches. The other thing worth noting at this point is that the order in which you do the stitches, you probably actually want to do your light stitches first, the lighter colors. And the reason for that is if you were to stitch, particularly with blacks and whites, if I was to stitch this pink or red right here and then run a thread over here and do this pink or red, I would have a thread running behind this light background. And when I came in later and stitched the light background, some dandruff from that thread would come up and there would be a slight shadow in your background. Again, it's particularly true if you were to run a very dark thread like a black or a dark green. You would see little shadows behind where that thread was behind it. So you should probably be doing your light colors first. Now what I will do is we're going to work first in green. So I'm going to strand up some green and I'll just show you how you pick and choose your way around to know where to put your stitches when you've got a painted canvas. All right, so I have stranded up one thread of vineyard silk. I'm working on 18 mesh canvas now. It's a little finer mesh, and the vineyard does a really nice job of filling it, and it has a nice shine to it. So the green that I've chosen, I'm going to have it be the lightest green that is in this garland. And I'm going to start up in the upper right here, and since this X is painted green, I'll be putting a green stitch over it. And then I'll work my way down. Here's another green stitch, so I will do this one. You can see that I'm skipping some of the other. I'm not going to do this stitch because that's painted red. I'm not going to do that great stitch because that's painted pink. I'm only going to do the stitches that are painted the color that I've chosen. And I don't need to go in a basket weave or a continental in rows. I can just kind of meander my way around, just making sure that I'm only putting threads across X's that have the color that matches the thread that is on my needle. I'll come back and get the other threads, or the other stitches, pardon me, when I have a different colored thread. Keep in mind too, let's say you buy a canvas and you really don't like the fact that she has a lot of pink on here, so maybe you'd like to change the color of some of the canvas. If your thread completely covers the X, you can. There's nothing that says, so see how I'm kind of done with the really bright greens right in here. So at this point, it doesn't matter. I can go over here and start working and work my way that way, or I can come down here and work my way this way. So I'm actually going to go over here and work my way that way with the green, with this light green. So I'll do this stitch. And eventually, when you've gotten enough threads of different colors such that you fill all this in, the pattern of the garland will come through really nicely. If you're doing a stitch like this, if you're doing a canvas that has lots of little types of areas, by the way, this is a canvas that is from Kelly Clark. So if you're looking for this canvas in particular, this is a Kelly Clark Angel. So now I'm going down here. There. So that gets you an idea of how to do some of those. And I'll switch and get another color so you can kind of see how they come in here. But what I was saying was, when you are done, because you're kind of putting this together piecemeal based on the color, I recommend that before you submit it to the finisher, you get yourself a really nice strong pair of reading glasses or magnifying glass, and you just search through the whole canvas and make sure that you don't have any missed stitches. When you're doing something like this, it's really easy to miss a stitch. So you'll probably want to just take a good read of that canvas and be sure that you've gotten all of the stitches covered. And you can certainly, so I was also saying that you can certainly choose different colors. Maybe you've picked a canvas that has a monogram on it and it's painted in red and you'd rather do the monogram in navy. You can typically just pick a navy thread and go over all the red spots with navy instead. And you do want to be sure, if you try and cover this light background, the light background in here with a navy, you may find some of the threads show through a little bit, so that you won't be as successful with that. But all the other ones you can pretty much change. So I'm going to switch to another color thread and show you how to put in the next color. Now I have gotten on my needle one of the darker shades, and I'm actually going to use this. Let's zoom in. If you look at this, there's actually 3 colors of green. There's a very light, there's a medium, and then there's a quite dark. And I think I will treat this like the really dark, and then I'll look for a thread that's in between the two. And you know what? It doesn't need to be exactly how it's painted. Obviously, if you're doing something like a face, you probably will want to do it how it's painted, just so the eyes and the cheeks and the nose and the mouth are all in the right place. But in this case, whether the green dot is here or there, wherever, it really doesn't make that much difference. So I filled this green dot right here in. I've got another very dark green right here. And as you can see, some canvases, it's harder to see which is which green and which is the other. But make sure you're working in really good light. And if you need strong reading glasses, get yourself a pair of strong reading glasses. I have found that every year I get stronger and stronger, sadly. And it makes my life much, much easier, particularly working on 18 mesh. If you're having trouble seeing your work, consider, just for the sake of needlepoint, getting stronger ones, or even using a magnifying glass. So I filled in that stitch, this stitch, and my next dark one is actually way over here. So I'm just going to run right over here. And I know I'm breaking my own rule doing the darker first. I'll make a point of not running it behind anything that is light. Oh, there's my next dark stitch. And so that's it. That's how you do needlepoint when your canvas is painted and you want to do small areas. It's the same stitch, just match the thread with how the little X that you're going over is painted.